Alrighty, folks. Well, that looks like 3 o'clock on my watch, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome. I'll be your presenter this afternoon. My name is Benjamin Winter Orthris, and I would like to thank you for joining us for the 8th annual College Financial Aid Basics and our very first live stream event. So, thank you so much for joining us. Um, it has been my pleasure to present this workshop for the last 7 years in partnership with the Johnson County Library here in Johnson County, Kansas, and specifically with Ms. Marty Jo Haynes, the Career and Financial Services Librarian there at Johnson County. But this year, Marty and her team are focused on a new event, Women in Money Day, which is coming up, I believe, on October 12th. That's a free event available to the public, so I would encourage folks to check that out. And so that gave this year the opportunity for a new organization to step up and take over responsibility for this event. And so I'm very excited to announce our sponsor of the event this year is the Bridget Center for Education and Advocacy. I'm very proud to serve as co-founder and director of the Bridget Center. The Bridget Center is a virtual career development center. Our mission is to provide accessible, individualized education, career, and advocacy services that leverage widely available technologies to improve the well-being of both clients served and our community, especially those who might not otherwise be served. So, a little bit about me. Again, my name is Benjamin Winter Orthris. I currently serve as an academic advisor, career counselor, and education advocate with the Bridget Center. Prior to that, I served as transfer and articulation officer at the University of Missouri Kansas City, assistant director of financial aid and scholarships at the University of Kansas, where my portfolio responsibility was specifically federal work study and international student grants. And then I've also served in a variety of student success and enrollment management roles at Metropolitan Community College and Johnson County Community College. I have a bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Emporia State University in social sciences, a master's degree in education from the University of St. Mary up in Leavenworth, and I'm currently working on my second graduate credential, a master's of arts in counseling with an emphasis on mental health at UMKC, which I hope to finish this May. So a little background about me there. Looking at today's conversation, our agenda here is we're going to do some basic definitions of what financial aid is and isn't, talk about some basic terms that you're likely to run into. We're going to define the different types of financial aid. We'll talk about how to apply for aid, specifically how to apply for the FAFSA, which is the big federal application every year, some tools and tips, and then we're also going to have a Q&A session at the end. Speaking of which, there is a few second delay between what I'm doing here on the broadcast end and what you're seeing live on YouTube. So any questions would be tough to answer live as we're going through here, but if you do have any questions or think of anything you'd like to ask, please feel free to drop that into the YouTube chat, and we will take a look at those at the end. Okay, so when we're talking about financial aid, what are we talking about? It actually includes quite a bit more than you might think. There are several types of aid, and when people talk about financial aid, first, usually what they mean is federal student aid. When we're talking about federal student aid, that's federal student grants, loans, and federal work study. This is the aid that requires the annual filing of the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA. And we'll talk more about the FAFSA application here in a little bit. But when folks talk about financial aid, this is generally what they mean, really, is federal student aid. Federal student aid, in terms of what it is it's really federal tax dollars, an investment in students and an investment in the future of our country. The modern financial aid system grew out of the GI Bill after World War II, investing in soldiers and their spouses to help re-educate them for the new workforce that had developed after World War II. And so that GI Bill, the first one, is what grew into what we know now as our federal financial aid system. And so I always talk to students when they sometimes talk about where's my money, when do I get my money, that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's worthwhile to remember it's not entirely it's not really their money, it's our money, it's your money, it's your neighbor's money, it's your spouse's money, it's all of our tax dollars. It's an investment of all of us in the future of our country. So something good to think about both for students and I think for us on the taxpayer side too sometimes. Now, when we're talking about non-federal sources of student aid, this includes things like institutional grants and scholarships, so like from the institution the student might be attending, teaching or research assistantships, private scholarships, private loans, family support, and student employment. So when a financial aid officer talks about financial aid, they're thinking about all of these sources. And the ones that tend to kind of sneak up on folks the most is a financial aid officer is going to want to specifically talk to you about family sources of support and student employment. So this is the part of financial aid that a lot of folks don't think about, but that if aid officers are trained to think about and ask about. So when we talk about financial aid, we're thinking about these sources and want to make sure that you are too. Going into some basic terms and definitions now. The biggest one that I want folks to come away with is the idea of what is cost of attendance. The cost of attendance is the total estimated cost to attend a particular institution. So it's broken down into two parts. If we look at the top part here, these are what are called direct billed expenses, and this assumes that a student's living on campus. But if they're living on campus, then these are all direct billed. So tuition for classes, fees, these are things that could be anything like athletic fees, fees to use the campus health center, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, if you're living in campus housing, your housing and meal costs. Indirect costs that are not billed by the school but that are still factored into your total cost of attendance include things like books and supplies, transportation, and this broad kind of generic category called personal expenses. The school puts together an estimate of what they think all of these things cost, and now they have to use the same estimate for all students, but that's how they come up with a generalized cost of attendance. Each student is also going to have a specific cost of attendance that reflects your particular enrollment, the particular major you're taking, again, whether or not you are living on campus, that kind of stuff. But the school has to come up with a generalized one to use for financial aid awarding purposes. We call this the financial aid bucket. The bucket basically is, okay, so if we factor all these costs together, what is the total cost to go to school? And that is the size of your bucket. And then financial aid is the thing that we use to fill that bucket to help you pay to go to school. So, financial aid rules, the reason the cost of attendance is really important is that we're not allowed to overfill a student's financial aid bucket by even a penny. Now, this doesn't run into an issue for most students unless students getting lots of scholarships or students who are financially fairly well off may run into this issue. So may not run an issue for you, but that's part of why we bring this up. Is this cost of attendance thing is really important because it's the number that everyone is using to estimate your total cost and what we're calculating your financial aid against. Some other terms: grant, free money, right? Easy. Scholarship, free money with strings attached. Work study, this is going to be an on-campus job, usually funded with either federal or state money. And then a student loan is going to be aid that students receive and must be repaid when the student leaves college, even if they don't graduate. EFC, expected family contribution. This is one of the other big terms I really want folks to hopefully walk away with an understanding of. This is the single number that your entire FAFSA, some 92 odd questions, is used to calculate. The EFC is the baseline for determining all aid eligibility. Your aid officer and the Department of Education will swear up, down, left, and sideways that the EFC is not a dollar figure. It is. They say it's an index number, It functionally is a dollar figure, and it's the amount that the federal government believes that your family can pay towards your student's education. It is often not connected to reality, and we'll look at a table here in a second that'll give us some estimates, but it is the number that we have to start with. So put that caveat out there. Enrollment status, this is important. Full-time students are usually eligible for more aid. Full-time qualifies 12 credit hours per semester at most institutions. Half-time students, 6 to 11 credit hours. Students have to be at least half-time in order to get financial aid at all. Grace period, for most types of federal aid, I should say. Not entirely true for all types of aid, but for most types of aid have to be at least half-time. Grace period, time after a student withdraws, graduate, or falls below half-time enrollment before they have to start repaying their loans. Dependent student is a student who is under 24 years old, unmarried, has no dependents, is not a military veteran, most quote-unquote traditional college students. Independent students are everybody else, students who are over 24 years old, or married, or a graduate student, or a veteran, or a ward of the state. So unless students fall into a specific category, most traditional college students are going to be dependent. Dependent students require tax and income information from at least one parent to apply for financial aid. So this is why this is important. This is true even if the student is not claimed on a parent's income taxes, does not live at home. If your 23-year-old student is completely socially and financially independent and lives on their own, they are still going to get dinged if one parent isn't willing to provide their financial information as part of the FAFSA. The IRS and the Department of Education define independent very differently, and in this instance, the Department of Education rules supersede those of the IRS. So, independent students, they do not require parental information to apply for financial aid, but this presentation is going to assume dependent status since it applies to most traditional age college students. So when we are talking about types of financial aid, there are generally two flavors of aid that we'll talk about. The first is need-based financial aid, and this is where that all-important EFC comes in. The way that we calculate your need is we take that cost of attendance bucket, we subtract the EFC, and what is left is a student's need. Okay? So let's use the University of Kansas for an example. A couple of years ago when I worked there, KU's average cost of attendance was about $25,000 a year. So let's say that's the size of your cost of attendance bucket, $25,000. Let's say after completing your FAFSA, the FAFSA comes back and says your expected family contribution is $5,000. Okay? Because again, that's how much the federal government thinks you can pay towards your child's education or whoever the student is in your life, based on that calculation. So the need remaining, we have a cost of attendance of $25,000 and an EFC of $5,000, then the need remaining is $20,000, right? And that's the amount that your financial aid officer is trying to help you cover. Need-based aid includes all forms of federal grants and some types of loans. These are the types of aid that require the FAFSA filing. There's also some state and institutional types of aid that may be need-based. Kansas, for example, offers several additional need-based scholarships and grant opportunities, but students must pay to apply every year. I think the application fee is $30. So, rules may vary. Again, taking a look at that EFC, again, I'm not suggesting that it's always connected with reality, but it is the number that we have to start with. This is a guide that was published in Forbes magazine back in 2017, but the tables are still very similar to this. This is assuming a standard, this is assuming a household of 2 parents, and then look, you can see there along the top, the EFC changes by the number of dependents. Note that when you have folks in college in your household, the FAFSA asks as part of the application how many students or how many people within your household will be attending college at the same time. And it basically, the EFC is basically divided by the number of people in the household attending school at the same time. So it doesn't even have to be a dependent child. So let's say if you're going back to school and maybe your child or your spouse is going to be in school at the same time, then that still counts as 2 people in the household going to school at the same time. So it's still going to help your EFC here. So the dependent child thing is a little bit misleading. It has more to do really with how many, the FAFSA is going to take into account how many dependent children there are in the household, but it also really more importantly wants to know how many folks are going to school. So a quick reference there for that. The second flavor of financial aid is merit-based financial aid, or aid based on your personal awesomeness. And if I can't include at least one dog meme in a presentation, then it's just not me. So, but again, these are based on your personal awesomeness in just about anything, whether that's academics, the arts, music, community service. There are scholarships for all types of different things. Now, jumping into the different types of federal student aid that are available. Most of these types of aid options require need, but not all of them. We'll pull out which ones do and don't. Federal aid eligibility. There's some prerequisites before folks can be eligible to receive federal financial aid. First is students must be able to prove that they have either completed high school or the GED or an equivalent. I know Missouri, for example, no longer uses the GED. I don't remember what their alternative is now, but whatever, high school diploma or equivalent. Second, students must be enrolled in an aid-eligible program at an accredited institution. So accredited institution is really the first thing to be looking for there. A lot of unaccredited institutions have been shut down in the last few years, a lot of for-profit schools. If you're looking at any major university or any, KU, K-State, Johnson County Community College, University of Kansas, or University of Missouri at Kansas City, Emporia State, any of those are all certainly accredited institutions. The thing you really want to be looking at is depending on the length of the aid program. All degree programs are federal aid eligible at an accredited institution. If you're looking at doing like a short-term training, maybe some kind of a certificate or something, if it's less than one full semester, it may not be eligible for federal financial aid. So if you're looking at a short-term training program, maybe at one of the local community colleges, check with your aid officer to make sure that your program is going to be aid eligible. Gentlemen must be registered with the Selective Service if you're between the ages of 18 and 25. If you have not registered with the Selective Service prior to completing the FAFSA, there is actually a box on the FAFSA that will let you register as part of your aid application, so don't worry about that. The last part here, these are all things that you have to do pretty much before enrollment, other than the halftime enrollment. But once you are enrolled, not only must you maintain at least halftime enrollment, but you also maintain satisfactory academic progress. This is an important concept, so we're going to go in and define it here. Satisfactory academic progress, or SAP, as we refer to it. The satisfactory academic progress standards are actually set by each individual institution, so the rules may change slightly depending on where you're attending. But there are some basic federal standards and kind of minimum requirements that are common to everybody. One is a cumulative GPA of at least 2.0, so that's a C average. That's usually required by most institutions to graduate as well, so that makes sense. Time to degree is 150%. So what that means is, let's say that your English degree that you're pursuing has 100 credit hours in it to complete that degree. And let's say at some point halfway through the English degree, you decide, nope, I don't want to do English, I'm actually going to do a major in history. Okay. You can still get financial aid as you've switched majors all the way up to the 149th credit hour. At 150th credit hour, if someone has completed 150 college credit hours when it should only take 100 to get a degree, even switching majors, there should still have been enough credits in there for you to finish a degree. So the federal government starts asking questions about why you haven't finished yet. This degree limit here is basically to keep folks from switching and going to school forever. The last part here, and this is the one that gets folks in trouble the most, is completion rate. This is the part that also most variable depending on institution. So you can see here I've got a couple examples in the Kansas City region, broadly in the Kansas region anyway. So looking at Kansas State University in Manhattan, their required completion rate is 75%. KU's is 70%. Rockhurst, over on the Kansas City, Missouri side, they require 67%, and Johnson County Community College requires 66%. Here's the thing, though. Some of these institutions calculate these cumulatively throughout a student's entire career, and sometimes institutions calculate them per semester. So again, you're going to have to check with your school. But most institutions calculate them cumulatively. That means it's going to be based on the total number of credit hours you've completed. This really gets to be a problem, particularly for freshman and sophomore students. And I'm going to give you a quick illustration here of how this gets people in trouble pretty quickly sometimes. So we have our student here. Let's say her name is Elena. Elena is really excited to be going to, let's say, Rockhurst University here in Kansas City, Missouri. And her first semester, she's really gung-ho and says, I'm going to be a really engaged student, and I'm going to take 6 classes and 18 credit hours. And then once she gets onto campus, maybe she finds a club that she gets really excited and engaged with, and she has some social communities that she engages with, and figures out, okay, 6 classes is too much. I'm going to drop one, but I think I can handle the others. And it turns out she was overestimating and maybe fails one of those classes. This is a very classic first semester for a lot of students. However, what's difficult here is if we look at the cumulative completion rate, and it looks like part of this is blocked by my head here in the video, but depending on what institution that Elena is attending, at Johnson County Community College or Rockhurst, for example, she's still eligible for aid the second semester of her freshman year. At the University of Kansas or K-State, though, she's now lost her eligibility and she's not even a full year into her studies. So For a junior, for example, who had this kind of year or semester, not nearly as damaging because they've got a lot more credit hours, right? They've got 60 some credit hours by then. But for a freshman, it's really easy to slip below the satisfactory academic progress minimums. And so always encourage students to be thoughtful and careful about this, and don't overload yourself your first semester. You're learning a lot. There's a lot of stuff about college that isn't actually learned in the classroom. It's about, getting around campus and figuring out what social groups you gel with, all of those things. So there's a lot of stuff to learn your first year at college besides what's going on in the classroom. So be mindful of that. Give yourself some space and don't overload yourself. All right, let's talk about some types of federal aid programs now. First, we'll talk about the federal Pell Grant, which is the largest and probably best known grant program. This one is based on need. It determined via a student's EFC. Excuse me. I'll take a little sip here. Okay. So the annual maximum this year is the same as last year's. It's set at $6,195 for students with a 0 EFC. And if you recall to our table, household income has to be awfully low for a 0 EFC. It is then a sliding scale, all the way up from 0 EFC to a max EFC of $5,576. At that point, a student would receive a minimum of about $600. So you can see the scale is pretty big, from about $600 of Pell money all the way up to almost $6,200 of Pell money. Again, depending on your EFC. However much money a student gets, it's going to be split 50-50 between the fall semester and the spring semester. There is a limit of 12 semesters, or 6 years basically, of eligibility. Again, this is another one of those limits of not a lot of students will run into it, but folks who have maybe continually changed majors or have struggled to complete a degree may run into this problem. So another one of those limits to try to keep folks from going to school forever. Federal work study. This is also a need-based form of aid, and students on their FAFSA will need to indicate that they are interested in a work study award. It is an on-campus job, usually paid by 75 to 100% of funds from the federal government. This will show up if students elect to include this as part of their financial aid package as any other aid award, so it'll look like potentially a scholarship or a grant or something else with a total dollar amount of maybe, say, $2,500 associated with it on the aid award letter. However, families should know that it is not like a chunk of money that's given out at the beginning of the semester like other forms of aid. It is, in fact, a job that students have to interview for, or, find on campus, interview for, and get hired. And the money that they are awarded is not paid out in a chunk, but in regular paychecks, usually weekly or bi-weekly, just like any other job. Students will have to pay income taxes on this income, just like any other job, FICA and all of that stuff. And there is a limited amount of federal work-study funds available at each institution every year, so students may not be able to work as many hours as they would like. It can depend on how much money they're awarded and how much money is available at the institution. The thing, though, that I think is important about work-study and why I encourage students to think about it is if you're going to have to work while going to school anyway, if that's the case for you, then it is always to your interest to get a job on campus over a job off campus, because a job on campus, first of all, you're going to have an employer that at least hopefully is aware of the fact that you're there as a student first and an employee second. So they're going to prioritize your education. But secondly, the advantage of if you can get an on-campus job through a work-study program here, let's say that the same student, they're going to work and make, say, $3,000 over the course of a semester. One off-campus doing maybe busing at a local bar, and another working in the library as a federal work-study job. That $3,000, when it comes to figure out the FAFSA the following year, if it was earned through a regular job, is going to have to be declared as income on the FAFSA, and it will increase the expected family contribution. It will make it go up. If that same income was made in a work-study job, it's not considered income in the same way on the FAFSA, and so it keeps that EFC down. And so work-study is a way to, one, help get some cash in your pocket. Think of it as spending money, not as a way to pay major bills, but daily expenses, and a way to potentially increase your aid eligibility the following year. So, something to think about there. Now, we'll talk about the Federal Direct / Stafford loan. Now, technically the Stafford loan is dead and has been for several years, but People keep referring to it as such, so it is the federal direct loan program is the evolution of the Stafford loan program. It is federally funded and the most common loan type. It offers both need based and also cost of attendance based limits. We'll talk about that here in a sec. 6-month grace period. Its interest rate is 4.5%. That was for last academic year, actually. Congress sets these rates every summer, and they haven't set them yet for the coming academic year. But estimates are that it's going to stay probably about where it is. So it's been in the 4 to 5% range for a decade or so now. Origination fee is about 1%, so that's money that the feds are going to keep to pay their operation costs of overseeing and dispersing the loan. So when we talk about both need and cost of attendance base, here's how we get to that. First of all students, regardless of EFC or need, are eligible to borrow $5,500 a year their freshman year. Assuming they complete at least 30 credit hours, their sophomore year they'll be eligible for $6,500. Then their junior and senior year each, they'll be eligible for $7,500. However much students borrow is going to be split in half and dispersed between both the spring and fall semesters. And again, this origination fee is going to come out of that, so it won't actually be a full $5,500. It'll be slightly less. The need-based part of this has to do with whether the loan is subsidized or unsubsidized. Two sides of the same loan program, but for students who have need, so let's go back to our student who's attending KU with a $20,000 cost of attendance need bucket. Okay, so we got $25,000 cost of attendance bucket, $5,000 at EFC, so we got $20,000 of need to fill, right? So since that student has need left in their cost of attendance bucket, $35,000 of this $5,500 would be subsidized, or the government would be paying interest on it while the student is enrolled. If the student chose to borrow the full $5,500, those $2,000 above what was subsidized, the student is still going to have interest charged on that while they're enrolled. So I know kind of a mess, but what we're really looking at here is that it's all the same loan program, but the same money within that program will be treated differently depending on your student's need. And so there is some opportunity here to get that subsidized loan. Hopefully then the government's paying interest on at least part of your loan debt while the student's in school. Okay, second most common type of loan is the Direct Parent Plus loan, which is actually a little bit redundant because PLUS stands for the Parent Loan for Undergraduate Students. This is the fill the gap loan. So again, let's go back to our KU student who's got the $25,000. So we've done $25,000, $5,000 has been filled, supposedly the family's got that available to pay on their own. Let's say the student took out another $5,000 in loan debt in their own name just to keep the numbers easy. So again, freshmen could take $5,500, but we're going to treat it as $5,000 just to keep the numbers easy. So $5,000 in family contribution, $5,000 in loan debt in the student's name. We got a $25,000 total cost, so we got $15,000 left to fill, right? The loan option that KU is going to offer, and most institutions are going to offer to fill that gap, is the Parent Plus loan. It is not limited by how much a parent can borrow each year. It's limited by what that gap is between the students, the rest of the aid package, and the student's total cost of attendance. It is a loan in a parent's name for a student's benefit. Only one parent or step-parent can apply per loan. So even if folks are married, for this loan application, it is not relevant. It is going to be just one person. Applicants cannot have a quote-unquote adverse credit history. This basically means, do you have something, let's see, and the technical standard is it's not a firm or hard credit check the same way that like a credit card or standard bank loan would be. What the government is basically looking for is, do you have any accounts in the last 18 months that are more than 90 days delinquent? And if so, there's a dollar amount they're looking for there. But that's what they're looking for with an adverse credit history. The interest rate on the loan is a little high. Again, these haven't technically been set for next year, but we can guess what they are based on what they have been this year. Interest rate is at 7.6%. The origination fee is 4.2%, so considerably higher than it is for the direct loan in the student's name. There is no grace period on these loans. They go into repayment 90 days after disbursement. So as soon as your student starts school, you're going to hear from your loan servicer 90 days later asking how you would like to make payment arrangements. They can be deferred while the student is enrolled at least half time, so 6 credit hours or more. However, that's going to be accruing interest. So we always encourage folks to at least try to pay the interest on those loans if they can. So some benefits of federal loans. Many repayment options. Students can repay them on over 10 to up to 25 years if necessary. There are income-sensitive repayment options. This is primarily for the loans in the student's name, not so much for the Parent Plus loan. Forbearance options. This is true of all loans. If you have financial hardships, let's say somebody loses a job, there's an unexpected illness, some kind of disaster, maybe a fire, somebody loses a home, that kind of thing. If you have one of those emergencies, you can qualify for forbearance, where your loan servicer will let you take 3-month, 6-month, or even a 12-month pause in making your loan payments as a result of that emergency. They can only offer that assistance if you communicate with your loan servicer. So if something happens, please contact your loan servicer. Don't just let them sit in the dark. There is also an option for federal consolidation loans. This bundles all of your federal loans together and makes repayment a single payment, one at a time. Makes it much easier to manage. So you can bundle all those loans together, except Parent Plus loans cannot be combined with loans in the student name. One of the big things that is really important about this is I used to work in insurance and financial services before I jumped into higher education. And so my legacy as a life insurance officer is showing out here, or life insurance agent rather. I always encourage families when they take on significant debt to think about what happens if the worst should happen. And so in the event that your student should pass away or become disabled for some reason, one of the major loans of federal, or major benefits rather, of federal loans is that that debt gets wiped out. And that includes the Parent Plus loans that were taken out for the benefit of the student. So all the loans in the student's name and any Parent Plus loans would be wiped out. Also, these excuse me, take another sip of water here. Okay. All of these loans, with the exception of the Plus loan, are not based on creditworthiness. And again, there are forgiveness options. Public service debt forgiveness after 10 years of full-time public service or non-employment or nonprofit employment. You may have heard in the news lately that there have been a lot of folks who have applied for public service loan forgiveness and deemed not eligible. That continues to go in the courts. But as of right now, that is still the law, and there is still every reason to believe that folks would still qualify for at least some debt forgiveness. So an option to be aware of. There are some non-federal student aid options that we should talk about, including the dreaded private or alternative loan. I want to touch on these first because they are what I refer to as the aid of last resort. I always encourage folks to avoid these if you can. Folks will sometimes consider them as an alternative to a Parent Plus loan because the interest rate, they think the interest rate is better, or they think they can get better terms. And sometimes you can. That's true. However, I encourage folks to avoid them for a couple of reasons. One, they can have variable interest rates that change over time. These loans are always unsubsidized. There are usually no grace periods. Repayment options are going to be limited and fixed at the beginning of when you take out the loan. There may not be an option to consolidate your loan later, and there will certainly not be an option to consolidate this with your federal debt. It will always be separate. And these loans are always based on some sort of creditworthiness. So that means that very few 18-year-olds can qualify for a loan on creditworthiness by themselves. And so that means, in general, they're co-signing with somebody. And that co-signer is usually a parent or another family member. And this is where folks sometimes get into trouble. The young lady pictured here, nursing student. And she, unfortunately, shortly after completing her nursing degree in California, was killed in a car accident. She and her family had decided, instead of using federal loans, to use private educational loans that her father co-signed on for her. When she was killed in her car accident, again, if this had been federal debt, then that would have been wiped out. Unfortunately, because it was not, her dad is still on the hook for what is now $200,000 in private education debt, as well as having to raise his daughter's young child after her passing. So I know this is a dramatic story, but I bring it up to make the point that if folks are going to go with something outside the federal aid system, then just be sure that you're reading your terms and know exactly what you're getting into and the potential consequences of that. Okay, so hopefully picking up from there, we're now going to talk about free money. Institutional grants are usually a form of need-based aid that a university or college will offer to a student that they really want to recruit who maybe just isn't getting enough aid to make ends meet. Availability varies widely from institution to institution. If you are offered this money, you always want to ask if it's renewable because these grants are often offered as kind of like a signing bonus of a student they really want to bring in. Maybe you can't figure out how to fill that last $3,000 in your cost of attendance bucket, and so they'll offer you, a grant to cover that. Often those are one-time get you in the door types of aid. They may not be renewable. So if you get one of those, if you get a grant of any kind, really, on your aid award letter that is anything other than a Pell Grant, an institutional grant of some kind, check and make sure that it's renewable so that you'll know what your aid eligibility is going to be in future years. Scholarships. Again, looking at your merit aid based on your personal awesomeness. I always encourage folks, first and foremost, look local. Start with any special interest organizations that you may belong to. So, faith, community, or service organizations. If folks have minority status, they're a first generation student, maybe you belong to an arts organization, sports team, maybe there's a professional organization, Grandpa's local Moose Lodge. Any of these organizations, any and all of them may have scholarship money available. So, always encourage folks to reach out to those local connections and find out if there's money available, even if it's $500. That's a semester's worth of books. That's gas in the car to get students to and from campus. So small amounts add up. So encourage folks to look at these organizations and see what opportunities may be out there. The point here is that these are organizations that already have a connection to you and to your family, and so folks tend to do better with those aid applications and scholarship applications than when they go out to, say, like a fastweb.com, which is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, scholarship search engines. It's a fine tool. I don't reference it much here in the presentation, though, because I think of that as kind of the shotgun approach, where folks are looking through and applying to maybe 50 or 100 scholarships. And frankly, if that's the website approach you're going to take, it can be done, but students need to be prepared to apply for 50 to 100 scholarships in order to get anything out of that. What I would encourage students instead is they're likely to get better traction out of maybe looking to 4 or 5 local organizations that they have a connection with, and seeing if there's financial aid options available with them. These organizations already know either the student or their family, and so they're more likely to invest in them. Looking also at institutional scholarships, often offered direct by a college or university. Here in the state of Kansas, for many of these scholarships, they've gone to a pretty standard grid system where the grid is going to be based on a student's ACT scores and GPA. So, a 3.5 GPA with a 30 ACT score, comes out with X amount of scholarship dollars. So that information, the downside of that, of course, is that if your student doesn't do well with testing or perhaps has a GPA that is not reflective of their actual intellectual capabilities, then they are not well served by that kind of system. On the upside, that does mean that you can go to many of these public university websites and get a very quick reference on exactly the kind of money that your student might be eligible for. The last type of scholarship aid that I encourage folks to think about that is sometimes not included in a formal aid award letter, and sometimes is not even administered by the financial aid office at your institution, would be departmental aid. And this is financial aid offered by, let's say your student is interested in being a pre-med major. So perhaps there is a pre-med department at your particular institution, and they may have scholarship money to offer that they administer directly. This was certainly true when I worked, for example, at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, the School of Medicine, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the College Conservatory of Music, for example, all had their own scholarship officers and financial aid that they administered independent of the financial aid office. So if you know what you want to study and have a strong idea of your major and your plans, both for school and perhaps after, go to the department or the major that you're interested in studying at a particular institution, and they may have money for you. So certainly check with them and see what's available out there. Something to know about a lot of these department scholarships as well is that even if they don't have money their first year, they often have scholarship opportunities for continuing students. So this may be an opportunity to make up for, let's say you were offered one of those signing bonuses grants, $3,000 there. This might be an opportunity to pick up a departmental scholarship your sophomore year, maybe after doing some research or something, to make up for that lost grant. So something to consider there. In general, and we'll see if I get in trouble for having this graphic on here, but in general, go with where people know you. Start with personal connections first, then go to your search engines. Because again, the idea is if folks know you or know your student, they're more likely to engage with their success. Some things to know about scholarships, though. All scholarships are going to have their own unique aid requirements, and they're going to be different from federal aid. They may have a satisfactory academic progress requirement, but instead of a 2.0, it may be a 3.5. It could be significantly higher. So students need to look at the specific requirements for a scholarship in order to keep that scholarship. Similarly, students need to be aware of whether or not those scholarships are renewable. Sometimes scholarships are one-shot deals, and sometimes there's something that can be renewed for multiple years. Figuring out which flavor of scholarship you've got and how long it's renewable could be really important. For transfer students, for example, often their scholarships are not renewable for a full 4 years. The idea is they're coming in with at least some of their credits completed. So they're often limited to 3 years of renewability, for example. So something to know. Scholarships amount also can sometimes be subtracted from other forms of aid. So let's talk about this. Let's go back to our fictional KU student, right? And we had that $25,000 bucket. We had filled it with $5,000 of family contributions, $5,000 of student contributions through loan debt, and then we had $15,000 left. So let's say that KU decided to offer that student $5,000 in a need-based grant as a signing bonus grant to try to get that student to attend KU, leaving $10,000 left up here. And parents took that out in a Parent Plus loan, let's say. So student beats the pavement, goes out, looks for those scholarships, and is able to get $5,000 in scholarships. Hooray, that's great, right? Their external scholarships reports them to KU. What KU might do, and I'm using KU as our example here, they may or may not actually do this, but in our hypothetical situation here, so the students made $5,000 in scholarships, they now report that to the university. The university says, oh, that's great, good for you. You have now reduced your need by $5,000. So we're going to take back that $5,000 need-based grant we gave you because your need is now lower. And so we're going to go give that to another student who has higher need. It was kind of a tortured example, but I hope I'm making my point here is that sometimes external scholarships, if a student is getting need-based aid at an institution from the institution itself, so not federal aid, but institution-based need-based aid, and they bring in outside scholarships, they may see a reduction in that institutional need-based aid. Something to be aware of. You can ask the institution straight up. Many institutions have taken a stand on whether they will or will not reduce need-based aid based on outside scholarships, and they will just tell you straight up beforehand. So ask your aid officer. Also, even with all these caveats, one of the ways that students, as they're building their resumes and looking to stand out against their counterparts, is the scholarships and awards that they win and that they become eligible for as part of their academic career. So these are things, they're absolutely resume builders and also opportunities to network. So beyond the money, there is also other reasons to engage in scholarship search. But something to know about, again, that balance between need and merit-based aid. Applying for aid, completing the annual FAFSA. So the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. I will say that again, the free application of federal student aid. I say that because there are many people who will like to try to charge you for the benefit of completing your free application for federal student aid. Do not let them do it. Again, folks are charging you for something that is not as complicated as it seems and that you absolutely can complete on your own. Sometimes accountants and that kind of stuff will do it as a free add-on service if they already do your taxes with them. I've had clients say that before and students. So if that's the case, great. Otherwise, though, do not pay a professional to complete your FAFSA for you. It's not necessary. It is the application used for all federal types of student aid and is also the basis for many need-based institutional types of aid, and students must complete the application every year. Now, when we're looking at what information the FAFSA is actually pulling from, it is not looking at last year's tax or income information, but is looking at what is called the prior year, or 2 years ago. This is a fairly new switch, something that was employed, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. Not even that long ago now, 2 to 3 years now. I forget if it was 16 or 17. But the idea here is that the problem before was that when students had to try to complete the FAFSA on January 1 for the following academic year, but taxes hadn't even necessarily been filed until April 15th. People were doing a lot of guesstimates and then having to go back and do corrections. The idea here is that hopefully by now everyone's 2017 or 2018 taxes will have been filed by the time they're completing the 2020-2021 FAFSA, which becomes available October 1st. So the idea is, okay, with finalized tax information, there's no more estimates. We're not having to do corrections later. And we're able to get folks information about their aid eligibility sooner so that families have more time to make decisions. So again, the whole goal here is to get to more informed admissions decisions so people can decide earlier what's going to make sense for them. The downside here is, of course, 2 years is a long time, and so things may have happened between when your taxes were filed for 2018 and what's going on as you're getting ready to go to school or send someone in your family to school for fall 2020. So in that case, we'll talk more about what some options are if that's your situation. But the idea here is kind of that's the downside, is that by going further back, it's further back, and so it's not necessarily going to reflect the reality of your family or your situation right now. So in order to complete your FAFSA, you're going to need a couple of things. One is you're going to need your 2018 tax returns, both for the student and for, again, at least one parent. You're going to need information about your assets. And when they're talking about assets, they're basically, the feds are looking for stuff that could fairly easily be converted to cash. So they're looking for, on the day that you completed the FAFSA, it's a snapshot in time, they're looking for, on that day, the value of your checking and savings accounts, any business income or business assets that are held personally, any real estate investments, so real estate property that's owned, or sorry, other investments, so real estate that's owned, uniform gift to minor accounts, stocks, bonds, anything that's held that, again, could theoretically be converted to cash. And then untaxed income, so disability benefits, veterans benefits, child support payments, alimony, anything like that. That's the asset income information that the FAFSA is looking for. Things they are not looking for, however, are like when they ask for real estate information, if you only own one home and it's the one that you live in, they don't need that information. Your primary residence is not included. Your primary vehicle, the one, your daily beater that you drive to and from work, that one's not included. They're only looking for stuff that could, again, be sold off in theory and converted to cash to pay for school. The other thing that is not included is retirement accounts. So if you have a 401k, an IRA, any of that stuff where you put retirement funds in, that money does not count towards your asset information for the FAFSA. And so folks who have perhaps significant investments in stocks, bonds, or things that are not held in a retirement account may want to work with a accountant or retirement professional to think about moving some of those assets into a retirement account in order to improve their FAFSA filing. So something to think about. In terms of when students should be considering to file the FAFSA, the deadlines are all different depending on what we're looking at. For the federal deadline, students can actually apply all the way up until the summer after the academic year they've completed and still get federal aid. So this is for folks who maybe families decide they don't need to apply for federal financial aid, and then perhaps in May of the student's freshman year, perhaps there is some kind of family emergency or somebody loses a job, and suddenly that $5,500 that the student was eligible to borrow would become real helpful. That's why there's this late application deadline where you could basically backdate your aid application so that students can get aid kind of retroactively. So that's why that is out there, and I want to make folks aware of it, specifically for those emergency situation provisions. However, everybody else wants you to fill it out considerably earlier. In Kansas, the application priority deadline is April 1st, so that's April 1st, 2020. Each college, though, is also going to have their own priority deadline, and those are changing as more schools adapt to the prior year FAFSA application. They're moving their scholarship priority application dates up earlier and earlier. For example, the University of Kansas and Kansas State University have set their priority application dates now actually in the fall of 2019 for the fall of 2020. So it's still December 1st for 2019 in order to be considered for the maximum amount of financial aid. So students need to consider filing the FAFSA by that December 1 date if they want to go to KU or K-State. However, UMKC and Johnson County Community College are both examples of schools that still have their financial aid priority application deadlines in the spring. So wherever you're planning on going, check out their financial aid office and figure out where their or when their priority deadline is, and know that that's when you'll need to complete your FAFSA, by that priority deadline. Couple things to keep in mind. Many schools have not yet updated their aid application dates, but they're working on it, or they're making incremental changes of slowly inching them forward, maybe 2 weeks or a month, 1 year, and then the following year they'll move it forward more. Earlier aid offers is the advantage here. They want to, again, try to get admissions and aid information out to students as quickly as possible. The downside here is that, from your freshman year to your sophomore year, your aid application deadline may change. And so students need to be keeping an eye on this because the situation is going to continue to evolve. Once students have completed the FAFSA, what they get back out is called the Student Aid Report, or a SAR. This summarizes your FAFSA information, provides that all-important EFC, and lists potential aid eligibility. I point this out because students will often get this and think, oh, this is my aid offer. This is how much federal aid I'm going to get. It is not that. Think of it as like a free estimate. It is the first blush review, but it guarantees you nothing because your aid offer doesn't actually come from the federal government. It's going to come from the school that you're planning to attend. So, the aid offer, award, or package, everybody uses slightly different language, but the aid that you're going to receive an offer will come direct from the school itself. It'll be based on the cost of attendance at that particular school, which is why the federal government can't tell you how much aid you're getting. They don't know the cost of attendance at the school that you're planning to attend. You can accept or decline any part of the award. So grants and scholarships are usually auto-accepted, but anything that's going to require debt, where you're going to take out a loan, you're going to have to accept or decline that. And there may be additional steps in order to complete, like a promissory note or to go through loan entrance counseling if you're going to take on any student debt. The time to generate these offers varies a lot from institution to institution, but in peak season, where they're processing a lot of aid applications, 2 or more weeks is not uncommon. So again, the earlier you get your aid application in, the better. All right, some tools, tips, and resources. First of all, in order to make good decisions about financial aid, I think folks need to have a good handle on what college actually costs. And so this is a good tool to take a look at that. It's called the College Scorecard. It was rolled out under the Obama administration. Go to this website here, just collegescorecard.ed.gov, or just search online for the College Scorecard. You'll be able to find information on any federal aid eligible college in the college or university in the United States. So remember we talked earlier about those aid eligible institutions or accredited institutions. All of the schools that come up in this search are going to be accredited institutions, which makes the search a good place to go. You can look for schools based on their size, their region, cost, major, the kind of campus setting you want, rural versus suburban or urban, that kind of thing. And for every school, you're also going to get a quick summary of the annual average cost, and that cost is after the average aid package has been taken into account. The graduation rate, which at any public institution you're looking. Well, let me put it this way. The 51% graduation rate at UMKC, here as our example, is not uncommon for large public universities. That's a pretty common graduation rate. So anything below that, anything below the 50% mark, I would be concerned. But folks will look at that and go, ooh, that looks pretty low. And it's, relatively speaking, it's not as low as it sounds. The last thing you're going to see here, though, is the salary after attending. And this information here is gobbledygook. You should ignore it. I say that because it's not a meaningful measure. For example, UMKC, where I am currently a student and formerly a staff member, I happen to know, for example, that we graduate petroleum engineers and elementary education teachers. Even on a really good year, an elementary education teacher is never going to make the kind of money that a petroleum engineer makes. But would not be happy being a petroleum engineer. There's a reason they're an elementary ed major. So your income potential is going to have a lot more to do with your particular major and the field that you're wanting to go into. And, well, not even necessarily your major, actually. The field you want to go into when you graduate and how you use your education is really what's going to dictate your salary. So again, this number here is, all that to say, fairly useless. Pay of no attention to it. It's always going to favor engineering schools and stuff with high net worth professionals that they graduate. So another tool that I like to refer folks to is the College Navigator. It is from the same the version of the same website that the scorecard is on, and it presents the data in a little different format. The thing I like about this versus the college scorecard is that College Navigator allows you to compare multiple institutions side to side. So you can compare completion rates, admissions data, that kind of stuff side to side. But the thing that's really important that I think is really useful out of this is if there was ever a single digit or a single number that I had to advise folks to decide the quality of an institution, it would be the loan default rate. And that's available through College Navigator. It's going to be down here at the bottom. So if you go to the website and look for an institution, you'll get a page that looks like this here, like what I've pulled up and did a screenshot with UMKC. But if you scroll down to the very bottom and click this out, you'll get the loan cohort default rates. What the loan default rate is how many people who either graduated or stopped to attend that particular year can't pay their loans, can't pay the amount due on their federal student loan debt. This to me is a pretty good, if you have to have a single digit indicator of the quality of an institution, the number of people able to pay their bills after attending that institution is a decent measure. And so for a public institution, these are the kind of numbers that we would want to see or lower. Anything more than about 10% of a loan default rate, so that would be 1 out of 10 people who attended an institution having trouble making ends meet, that starts to make me nervous. So these numbers that are below 10% down in the mid sevens, this is what, again, pretty typical of what you'd see for a large urban public university like UMKC. The one exception I'll say here is that if you use this tool to look up and you want to look at the loan default rate of any community college, so like Johnson County Community College or Kansas City, Kansas Community College here in the Kansas City Metro, don't hold them accountable for their loan default rate. Their loan default rates are ridiculous and very high, sometimes in the 20 or 30% rate. And that's because community colleges, by definition, have to accept everybody, even folks who are really not prepared and not financially ready to go to school. So they get students that sometimes, frankly, just aren't ready to be there yet, and those students sometimes get financially in trouble. So community colleges, it's not a real fair measure for them. But for anybody else, institutions are supposed to be have a responsibility not to admit folks who are going to get in over their heads financially. So something to be aware of. Some tips here. Communication is going to be really important. The situation we talked about earlier, where because of the prior year thing, where it's been 2 years since the tax information and income information you're using, if things have changed since then you may need to file what's called a special circumstances appeal or special circumstances review. And this is basically a situation where you get to say, my FAFSA does not accurately reflect my financial situation. Maybe, again, there's been a disaster since then. Maybe a house burned down. Maybe somebody's passed away or a job's been lost or somebody moved and got a new job. Things have changed, though. If your financial situation now no longer is very different, rather, from what it was when you filed your taxes in 2018, again, this is an opportunity to kind of ask your financial aid officer to take that into account. And depending on the nature of your special circumstances, they may be able to go to the Department of Education and request an adjustment in your EFC. So something to consider. If your financial situation at the end of your FAFSA, you don't feel like this reflects reality for you and your family, then go talk to your aid officer and they may be able to help. Compare multiple offers here. There is absolutely nothing wrong with if you get an aid offer get aid offers from multiple institutions. If College A offers $10,000 and College B offers $12,000, but you really want to go to College A, there's nothing wrong with asking them to meet College B's offer. Public institutions are less likely to be able to do this. They generally try to put their best foot forward in the initial aid offer, and so if you ask them to match or meet, they may not be able to do anything for you. But private institutions, so here in Kansas City, that would be places like Baker University, Ottawa University, Park University, William Jewell College, they may have more room to be flexible in the aid offer. So if you really want to go to William Jewell, but Baker University is making you a better aid offer, show William Jewell Baker's aid offer and see if they'll match it. Finally, relationship building is going to be really key. There are elements of student aid that can be confusing, and so it's always great to have an expert in your corner if you can. So try to get to know somebody in the financial aid office at your institution. Be honest and direct about your situation, and also ask them about their student privacy policies. There is a federal student privacy law that goes into effect here called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. It applies to all college students regardless of how old they are. So if you're the parent of a prodigy and have a student at 12 years old going to college, they're still considered an adult under this federal student privacy law. And so we as federal aid professionals and higher education professionals lose our ability to talk to parents about a lot of details when FERPA, or again, that Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, when it kicks in. Um, and often it can kick in from the parent side at what seems arbitrary, at an arbitrary time. When I was at KU, for example, FERPA for us kicked in the day that classes started. So all the way up to the first day of classes for incoming freshmen, I could talk to a parent at length about their student's financial aid package and other financial concerns. But as soon as classes started, unless a student had signed a release for me, I suddenly couldn't confirm anything about that student beyond the fact that they were enrolled. So student privacy policies are going to be slightly different from institution to institution, but talk to yours and find out what it's going to take. If you expect to have access to that information, it's going to be at your student's discretion, so you need to set that expectation with your student, and then you'll need to have the student and you talk to the institution to find out how you get access to the information that you need. A couple other additional tips and resources. First of all, the library still has some tremendous college resources and test prep resources in particular, so I encourage folks to check out both your local library and the Johnson County Library for resources. FAFSA.gov and StudentAid.gov, both of those have actually developed pretty well in the last few years, and they have some tremendous guides and resources available on there, so I encourage folks to take a look at that. And then also encourage folks to take a look at your local public financial aid office, even if you don't attend there. So what I mean by that is that particularly folks here, I'm in Johnson County, Kansas, and so for folks here in Johnson County with me, your local financial aid office is Johnson County Community College. Your tax dollars pay their salaries and pay their wages. That's what that institution is there for. And so this is true of most, particularly community colleges. Even if you're not attending, your student's not planning to attend the community college, if you have just general questions about how financial aid works or how to complete the FAFSA, contact the aid office at your local community college. They're often happy to help. Speaking of other help completing the FAFSA, though, for your folks located here in the Kansas City area, there is an event coming up on October 7th at the Monticello Johnson County Library branch. It'll be the second of two FAFSA step-by-step sessions. The first one they did looks like last week already, but the second one will be coming up on October 7th, and that's presented by Jason Anderson of Community America Credit Union. I don't know Jason personally, but I do know a little bit about Community America Credit Union's college and educational outreach. That's become a real emphasis for them over the last couple of years, and they appear to be doing good work. So if folks are looking for step-by-step FAFSA help, would encourage you to check out that event on the 7th at the Monticello Library. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation part. Again, I want to thank everybody for their attention today. It is not as complicated as it seems. I know we went through a lot, but the first time you get done with it, after that, it will seem much easier. And once you complete the FAFSA the first time, a lot of your answers can be copied over year to year, so that will make it easier. If you have a special situation or you're trying to get some additional information, be sure you're honest with your aid officer and when you're completing your FAFSA. And the final recommendation here is to select your professional help carefully. Here in Kansas City, unfortunately, there are a couple of folks who are fairly notorious for going around and setting up community information seminars and workshops at local libraries and community centers, where they'll provide information similar to what we've discussed tonight, but they're ultimately working to sell an investment product that which looks to be a fairly standard annuity of some kind. But again, we talked before about how retirement funds, if they're a retirement account, don't count against your FAFSA the same way. And so what these folks were basically doing is selling an investment product to encourage folks to take their cash assets and put them into an annuity to reduce their expected family contribution. This may or may not have been a good idea for those families. It may have been fine to do that. However, what was unethical about these folks is that they were charging people $1,500 for the privilege of taking their money and sticking it in a fairly standard annuity that any accountant or investment professional could have helped them with. Often charging also exorbitant monthly maintenance fees, $100 or $200 a month, on top of the $1,500 they took of the folks' money to invest these, again, in a fairly standard investment product. So if you are concerned about your assets and you are thinking about ways to maybe minimize your EFC, those are certainly legitimate things to be considered about, and would encourage you to choose your investment and advising professionals carefully. If somebody's representing themselves as a certified financial aid professional and they don't work for a university or college, then they're bluffing. There is no such thing as a certified financial aid professional outside of a true college or university setting. Even here at the Bridget Center, we don't claim to be certified financial aid professionals because, again, no such certification exists. So choose your professional help carefully. Um, and again, if all else fails, highly encourage you to start with your financial aid office at the institution you're attending or thinking about and work from there. If folks are looking for a financial planner or accountant to work with here in the Kansas City area, we do have some folks we can recommend. Please feel free to shoot us an email or connect with us after the presentation here for those recommendations if you'd look for one. So again, thank you so much. I am going to go ahead and turn off the video feed to see my lovely face here because you've probably seen enough of that. For a couple of minutes, we'll take a look at any questions that folks have posted and respond to those here in just a second. So thanks again to everybody who joined us today.